In this video, we bring to you the prisoners awaiting execution in the U.S. for March 2025. Their last words and meals. This is True Crime Records, where you get to know all the criminal records, legal proceedings and executions, including those who escape executions. Let's get in now. David Leonard Wood, infamously known as the Desert Slayer, was a convicted serial killer linked to the brutal murders of 6 young women in El Paso, Texas, between 1987 and 1988. His crimes shook the community, sparking widespread fear and one of the most extensive manhunts in the region's history. The case not only highlighted the horrors of serial violence but also revealed the limitations of forensic science at the time, the perseverance of law enforcement in seeking justice, and the complex ethical debates surrounding capital punishment. Sentenced to death in 1992, David Leonard Wood remained on death row for decades, awaiting his execution in 2025. This true crime record delves into the life of David Leonard Wood, his crimes, the investigation that led to his capture, his trial, the long appeals process, and the legacy he left behind. The case remains a pivotal moment in Texas criminal history, demonstrating both the challenges of prosecuting serial offenders and the lasting trauma inflicted on victims' families. David Leonard Wood was born on October 21, 1954, in Ohio. His early years were marked by instability, largely due to his father's military service, which required the family to relocate frequently. This lack of a stable home environment may have contributed to Wood's troubled behavioral patterns. By the time his family settled in El Paso, Texas, in the 1970s, Wood had already begun exhibiting signs of delinquency. Wood dropped out of high school and struggled to maintain steady employment. His early criminal record suggested a pattern of violent tendencies, particularly toward women. In 1974, at the age of 20, Wood was convicted of raping a 14-year-old girl at knife point. The attack was brutal, leaving the young victim traumatized. Wood was sentenced to 10 years in prison, though he only served 5 before being released on parole. Following his release, Wood continued to have run-ins with the law. He was arrested multiple times for parole violations, burglary, and assault. His inability to reintegrate into society and his escalating violent behavior painted a clear picture of a man on a dangerous path. Despite these warning signs, authorities did not yet recognize the full extent of his capacity for violence, until the disappearances began in 1987. Between March 1987 and August 1988, 6 young women vanished from the Lower Valley neighborhood of El Paso. Each of the victims was last seen near a desolate dirt road known as Mountain Pass, an area notorious for illicit activities, including drug use and prostitution. The victims included Rosa Maria Casio, 20, disappeared in March 1987. Isela Carrasco, 17, last seen in August 1987. Angelica Frausto, 15, went missing in March 1988. Irene Gallegos, 18, vanished in June 1988. Rosa Laura Rodriguez, 19, disappeared in July 1988. Carmen Estrada, 23, reported missing in August 1988. Each of these women fit a disturbing pattern. They were young, Hispanic, and either runaways or sex workers. Their bodies were later discovered in shallow graves scattered across the desert, their remains showing signs of strangulation or stabbing. The sheer brutality of the murders suggested the work of a serial predator. The El Paso Police Department, initially baffled by the disappearances, launched a task force in 1988 to track down the perpetrator. However, the case proved challenging due to the lack of physical evidence and the victims' transient lifestyles, which made it difficult to pinpoint their last known interactions. Several key breakthroughs eventually led authorities to David Leonard Wood. Investigators discovered tire tracks and shoe prints near some of the burial sites. These were later matched to Wood's blue pickup truck and a pair of boots he owned. A woman who had managed to escape an attempted abduction in the area provided a description of her attacker. She later identified Wood as the man who had tried to kidnap her. While in custody for an unrelated parole violation, Wood reportedly drew a map that led authorities to one of the victims' graves. Though he later recanted, this information strengthened the case against him. On September 18, 1988, David Leonard Wood was arrested. Law enforcement officers linked him to the crimes based on circumstantial evidence, including his history of violence, his presence in the areas where victims had last been seen, and his connection to some of the missing women. Wood's trial began in 1992, nearly 4 years after his arrest. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Jamie Esparza, presented a compelling case against him. They argued that Wood had targeted vulnerable women, luring them with offers of money or drugs before brutally murdering them. The key evidence against him included forensic anthropology. Experts confirmed that the skeletal remains showed signs of violent deaths, supporting the theory of a serial killer at work. Jailhouse informants. Several inmates who had interacted with Wood during his incarceration testified that he had boasted about killing multiple women. Behavioral analysis. Psychological experts detailed Wood's history of violent behavior, particularly his obsession with dominance and control over his victims. Despite the strong case against him, the defense, led by attorney M. Clara Hernandez, attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's claims. They argued that there was no direct physical evidence linking Wood to the murders and that witness testimonies were unreliable. Wood refused to testify in his own defense. After 6 hours of jury deliberation, he was convicted of 1 count of capital murder, the killing of Rosa Maria Casio. While he was suspected in the other 5 murders, those cases were never formally tried. Wood was sentenced to death. Wood spent 18 years on death row, filing multiple appeals in an attempt to overturn his conviction. His legal team argued that he had received ineffective counsel during his trial and that prosecutorial misconduct had influenced the jury's decision. However, his appeals were repeatedly denied. 1996. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld Wood's conviction and death sentence. 2007. A habeas corpus petition was filed, claiming new evidence could exonerate him, but it was rejected. After exhausting all legal options, Wood's execution was scheduled for March 13, 2025. On the day of his sentence, Wood made a brief final statement. "I'd like to apologize to my family for the pain I caused. To the victim's family, I can't explain why I did what I did. I don't know myself. I hope this gives you closure." One of her relatives later stated, "Justice was served, but our pain remains." David Leonard Wood's case left a lasting impact, raising questions about both the criminal justice system and the death penalty. Wood's prolonged appeals process, lasting over 2 decades, highlighted concerns about the efficiency and morality of capital punishment. Some argued that the length of time between sentencing and execution diminished its deterrent effect. The families of the murdered women became vocal advocates for missing persons reform, pushing for better resources to track and investigate disappearances. Had DNA testing been widely available in the late 1980s, investigators might have solved the case much sooner, potentially preventing some of the murders. Even as his death approaches, Wood's crimes remain a grim chapter in Texas history. His story serves as both a cautionary tale about the persistence of serial predators and a case study in the long, often difficult path toward justice. The second prisoner on death row scheduled for 2025 is Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr. Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr., born on September 1, 1978, in Louisiana, is an American convicted murderer currently on death row for the 1996 abduction, rape, and murder of 28-year-old advertising executive Mary Molly Elliott. At the age of 18, Hoffman's heinous actions not only led to his capital punishment sentence but also sparked ongoing debates about execution methods and prisoners' rights. As of March 2025, Hoffman is scheduled to be executed by nitrogen hypoxia on March 18th, marking Louisiana's first execution in over 15 years. On November 26, 1996, Mary Elliott, affectionately known as Molly, had just finished her workday in downtown New Orleans. She proceeded to the Sheraton parking garage, where she routinely parked her vehicle. It was here that she encountered Jesse Hoffman, who was employed as a valet at the garage. Hoffman, armed with a gun, abducted Elliott, forcing her into her own car. Under duress, Hoffman compelled Elliott to withdraw $200 from a nearby ATM. He then directed her to drive to a secluded area in St. Tammany Parish. Upon reaching the remote location near the Middle Pearl River, Hoffman sexually assaulted Elliott at gunpoint. After the assault, he forced her to kneel on a makeshift dock and executed her with a single gunshot to the head. Elliott's husband reported her missing on the evening of November 27, 1996, after she failed to meet him for dinner. 2 days later, on Thanksgiving Day, a duck hunter discovered Elliott's nude body on a makeshift dock by the Middle Pearl River in St. Tammany Parish. She had been shot in the head with a single bullet. The subsequent investigation led authorities to Jesse Hoffman. Evidence linking him to the crime included his employment at the parking garage where Elliott was abducted and forensic evidence recovered from the crime scene. Hoffman was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. On January 8, 1997, a St. Tammany Parish grand jury indicted Jesse Hoffman for the first-degree murder of Mary "Molly" Elliott. The trial commenced later that year, with the prosecution presenting compelling evidence of Hoffman's guilt, including forensic findings and eyewitness testimonies. The jury found Hoffman guilty as charged. During the sentencing phase, the jury unanimously recommended a death sentence, citing aggravating circumstances such as the perpetration of aggravated kidnapping, armed robbery, and aggravated rape, and the especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel nature of the offense. Following his conviction, Hoffman pursued multiple appeals, challenging both his conviction and sentence. However, these appeals were unsuccessful, and his death sentence was upheld. As of March 2025, Hoffman is scheduled to be executed by nitrogen hypoxia on March 18th. This method, recently adopted by Louisiana due to difficulties in obtaining lethal injection drugs, has become a focal point of legal and ethical debates. Hoffman has filed a lawsuit challenging the use of nitrogen hypoxia as the method of execution, arguing that it violates his Buddhist faith and could cause undue suffering. He contends that this method would interfere with his breathing meditation practices, which are central to his religious beliefs. Additionally, experts have testified that nitrogen hypoxia could result in a traumatic death, potentially affecting Hoffman's reincarnation, a core tenet of Buddhism. Alternative execution methods, such as firing squad or a lethal drug cocktail, have been proposed by Hoffman's legal team, citing them as more humane and less likely to cause unnecessary suffering. The state, however, maintains that nitrogen hypoxia is a humane method and plans to proceed with the execution as scheduled. The use of nitrogen hypoxia in executions remains highly controversial. Proponents argue that it is a painless method of execution that deprives the body of oxygen without causing the intense pain associated with lethal injections or electrocution. However, critics argue that the method is untested in real-world executions and could lead to prolonged suffering. Additionally, the secrecy surrounding execution protocols raises concerns about transparency and accountability in the justice system. Hoffman's case has ignited broader debates about the death penalty in the United States. Capital punishment has long been a contentious issue, with arguments both for and against its continued use. Supporters of the death penalty argue that it serves as a deterrent to violent crime, delivers justice for victims and their families, and ensures that dangerous criminals are permanently removed from society. Opponents, however, contend that the death penalty is applied disproportionately, carries the risk of wrongful executions, and violates basic human rights. The history of the death penalty in Louisiana reflects these broader national debates. Louisiana has executed individuals for decades, though the state has seen a decline in executions in recent years due to legal challenges, difficulties in obtaining lethal injection drugs, and shifting public attitudes. Hoffman's execution, if carried out, would mark the first execution in Louisiana in over 15 years, potentially signaling a renewed commitment to capital punishment enforcement. Religious and ethical considerations also play a significant role in Hoffman's case. His argument that nitrogen hypoxia violates his Buddhist beliefs raises important questions about religious freedoms for death row inmates. Courts have previously ruled in favor of prisoners' religious rights in various contexts, including allowing spiritual advisors in execution chambers and permitting last rites ceremonies. Hoffman's challenge could further define the scope of religious protections for condemned individuals. Moreover, the psychological and emotional impact of capital punishment extends beyond the inmate to victims' families, prison staff, and society at large. For Elliott's family, Hoffman's execution may bring a sense of closure and justice, though opinions on this vary. Some families of murder victims find solace in the execution of the perpetrator, while others advocate for life imprisonment as a more appropriate punishment. Additionally, the psychological toll on prison staff involved in executions is well documented, with many reporting trauma and emotional distress from carrying out state-sanctioned killings. As of March 8, 2025, Jesse Hoffman remains on death row at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. His execution is scheduled for March 18, 2025, pending the outcome of ongoing legal challenges regarding the execution method. This case continues to evoke discussions on the ethics of execution methods, prisoners' religious rights, and the broader implications of capital punishment in the United States. The case of Jesse Hoffman underscores the complexities inherent in the American criminal justice system, particularly concerning capital punishment. As the scheduled execution date approaches, the legal battles surrounding the method of execution highlight the ongoing debates about humane treatment, religious freedoms, and the ethical considerations of state-sanctioned death. The outcome of Hoffman's case may set significant precedents for future executions in Louisiana and potentially influence national discourse on the subject. Following him next is Aaron Gunches. On March 19, 2024, the state of Arizona planned to execute Aaron Brian Gunches, a 51-year-old inmate convicted of the 2002 murder of Ted Price, a crime that shocked the quiet desert communities of Pinal County and ignited decades of legal and ethical debates over the death penalty. Gunch's case is a labyrinth of violence, procedural disputes, mental health struggles, and political friction, reflecting the complexities of capital punishment in America. The brutal crime that condemned him to death row, the legal battles that followed, and the unresolved questions surrounding his scheduled execution. Aaron Gunches was born in 1972, though details of his early life remain sparse in public records. What is known is that his adulthood was marked by instability, criminal activity, and incarceration. By the late 1990s, Gunches had already served prison time for aggravated assault, a conviction that foreshadowed the violence that would define his future. His relationship with Karen Price, Ted's estranged wife, became the catalyst for the crime that would land him on death row. Ted Price, a 37-year-old electrician, and Karen had a tumultuous marriage. Their relationship deteriorated further when Karen began an affair with Gunches, who was living in a trailer on the Price's property in Queen Creek, Arizona. By 2002, tensions had escalated to the point of no return. On November 23, 2002, Ted Price drove to his stepdaughter's home in Mesa, Arizona, to pick up his 14-year-old stepdaughter, Lauren, name changed to protect privacy, for a court-ordered visitation. Unbeknownst to Ted, Karen and Gunches had orchestrated a plan to ambush him. According to court documents and witness testimonies, Gunches lay in wait outside the home. When Ted arrived, Gunches confronted him with a .22 caliber rifle, forced him into his truck, and drove him to a remote desert area near the Gila River Indian community. There, Gunches shot Ted multiple times in the back, execution style, before leaving his body in the desert. The brutality of the crime was compounded by the abduction of Lauren, whom Gunches and Karen kidnapped at gunpoint. The pair fled Arizona with Lauren, sparking a multi-state manhunt. They were apprehended days later in Moses Lake, Washington, where authorities found the teenager unharmed. Gunches and Karen were extradited to Arizona to face charges. Karen Price eventually accepted a plea deal, testifying against Gunches in exchange for a reduced sentence. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and kidnapping, receiving a 22-year prison term. Gunches, however, faced the full weight of Arizona's justice system. At his 2005 trial, prosecutors painted Gunches as a cold-blooded killer motivated by jealousy and a desire to eliminate Ted Price as a rival for Karen's affections. The state's case relied heavily on Karen's testimony, forensic evidence linking Gunches to the murder weapon, and cell phone records placing him near the crime scene. Gunches' defense team argued that Karen had manipulated him, claiming she masterminded the plot to kill Ted and frame Gunches. They emphasized his troubled mental state, citing a history of substance abuse and erratic behavior. However, jurors rejected these arguments, convicting Gunches of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and aggravated assault. He was sentenced to death in 2008 after a penalty phase that highlighted the especially cruel nature of the crime. For over a decade, Gunches' case languished in the appeals process, a common trajectory for death row inmates. His legal team filed petitions challenging the adequacy of his defense, the proportionality of his sentence, and Arizona's lethal injection protocols. In 2016, Gunches himself wrote a letter to the Arizona Supreme Court, urging the state to expedite his execution. "I've made my peace with God," he wrote. "I ask that you allow my sentence to be carried out so that justice may be served." This request stunned observers. Gunches' willingness to die stood in stark contrast to the typical behavior of death row inmates, who often fight for years to delay execution. His letter reignited public interest in the case, with anti-death penalty advocates questioning whether he was mentally competent to make such a decision. Yet Gunches' resolve wavered. By 2023, he had reversed course, filing a motion to withdraw his execution request. His new legal team argued that his earlier letter had been coerced and that he suffered from untreated mental illness. They also pointed to Arizona's troubled history with lethal injections, including the botched 2014 execution of Joseph Wood, who gasped for air for nearly 2 hours before dying. Gunches' case became a flashpoint in Arizona's broader debate over capital punishment. In January 2023, newly elected Attorney General Chris Mays, a Democrat, paused executions statewide, citing concerns about transparency and the integrity of the state's drug procurement process. This decision directly impacted Gunches, whose execution had initially been scheduled for April 2023. Meanwhile, Republican lawmakers and victims' rights groups pressured Mays to resume executions. Ted Price's family was divided. While some relatives supported Gunches' execution, his stepdaughter Lauren, now an adult, publicly opposed it. In a 2023 interview with the Arizona Republic, she stated, "Killing Aaron won't bring my dad back. It just continues the cycle of pain." The conflict reached a fever pitch in February 2024, when the Arizona Supreme Court set a new execution date for Gunches, March 19, 2024. Governor Katie Hobbs, a Democrat and death penalty skeptic, faced intense scrutiny. Though Hobbs had imposed a moratorium on executions in 2023 pending a review of protocols, the court's order forced her hand. As March 19 approached, Gunches' fate hinged on unresolved legal and ethical dilemmas. Psychologists hired by the defense diagnosed Gunches with borderline personality disorder and PTSD, arguing he lacked the capacity to rationally choose execution. Prosecutors dismissed these claims, citing his lucid courtroom behavior. Lauren Price's opposition to the execution clashed with Arizona's victim-centric laws, which traditionally prioritize the wishes of surviving family. Arizona's death penalty system has long faced criticism for racial disparities, inadequate legal representation, and arbitrary sentencing. Gunches, a white man, received the death penalty for a crime that might have spared a defendant of color, critics argued. Aaron Gunch's story is more than a true crime narrative. It is a prism through which Arizona's, and America's, ambivalence toward capital punishment is refracted. His execution date, March 19, 2024, arrived amid a fraught landscape. Declining public support for the death penalty, high-profile exonerations, and a growing recognition of its human and financial costs. Whether Gunch's sentence is carried out or commuted, his case underscores the irreconcilable tensions at the heart of the justice system. For some, his execution represents closure and retribution. For others, it perpetuates a cycle of violence that began on a desert night in 2002. What remains undeniable is that Ted Price's death, Lauren's trauma, and Gunch's decades on death row have left scars that no execution can heal. Next on the row is Wendell Arden Grissom. Wendell Arden Grissom, born in 1968, is a death row inmate in the state of Oklahoma, convicted for the brutal 2005 murder of 23-year-old Amber Dawn Matthews during a violent home invasion. His execution is scheduled for March 20, 2025, marking another chapter in Oklahoma's history of capital punishment. Grissom's case has been widely discussed due to the nature of the crime, the legal battle surrounding his conviction, and the ultimate decision to deny him clemency. As the execution date approaches, his case remains a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of violent crime and the complexities of the death penalty system. The crime took place on the night of July 17, 2005, in a rural area near Watonga, Oklahoma. Grissom, along with his accomplice Jesse Floyd Johns, targeted the home of Drew Kopf, a local resident. Amber Dawn Matthews was staying at Kopf's residence that evening, helping to care for his children while he was present in the home. Grissom and Johns, armed with firearms, forcibly entered the home with the intent to rob the occupants. What began as a home invasion quickly escalated into a horrific act of violence. As the men ransacked the house, an altercation broke out. Matthews, in an act of courage, attempted to protect the children inside. During the confrontation, Grissom fatally shot Matthews at close range. The gunshot wound proved to be instantly lethal, and she died at the scene. Kopf was also shot during the attack, but survived his injuries. Grissom and Johns fled the crime scene after the shooting, stealing valuables from the home in their escape. The brutal nature of the crime, combined with the fact that the murder occurred during a home invasion, led authorities to launch an extensive manhunt for the suspects. The investigation quickly led law enforcement to identify Grissom and Johns as the perpetrators. Within days, both men were apprehended and taken into custody. The evidence against them was substantial, including witness testimonies, forensic evidence, and items recovered from the crime scene that linked them to the murder. Grissom faced multiple charges, including first-degree murder, shooting with intent to kill, grand larceny, and possession of a firearm after a former conviction of a felony. Given the heinous nature of the crime and his prior criminal history, the prosecution pursued the death penalty. The case went to trial, where prosecutors detailed the events of the night, presenting the jury with compelling evidence of Grissom's direct involvement in the killing of Amber Matthews. The jury found him guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to death. Meanwhile, his accomplice, Jesse Floyd Johns, was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Following his conviction, Grissom and his legal team initiated a series of appeals, challenging both the verdict and the sentence. His defense attorneys argued that he did not receive a fair trial and that factors such as ineffective legal representation and procedural errors should warrant a reconsideration of his case. However, these appeals were systematically denied by higher courts, reaffirming the original conviction and the death sentence. The legal proceedings surrounding Grissom's case lasted for years, but his fate was ultimately sealed when the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board denied his clemency request in February 2025. The board, which has the authority to recommend clemency for death row inmates, voted 4-1 against granting him relief. This decision effectively cleared the way for his execution to proceed as scheduled. The ruling was met with mixed reactions. While the victim's family and law enforcement officials supported the board's decision, anti-death penalty activists continued to argue against capital punishment. The use of the death penalty in Oklahoma has long been a subject of controversy, with ongoing debates about its morality, effectiveness, and the potential for wrongful executions. Grissom's case, however, was not one of disputed guilt. The overwhelming evidence against him and the violent nature of the crime left little room for doubt. Nonetheless, his impending execution has reignited discussions on whether capital punishment serves as a just form of retribution or if it merely perpetuates a cycle of violence. Oklahoma has a long history of capital punishment and is one of the most active states in carrying out executions. The state has used various methods of execution over the years, including lethal injection, electrocution, and even the firing squad as a contingency method. In recent years, the state has faced legal challenges regarding its execution protocols, particularly concerning the use of lethal injection drugs. Despite these challenges, officials have continued to move forward with scheduled executions, asserting that justice must be served for the victims and their families. As Wendell Grissom's execution date draws closer, his case stands as a significant milestone in Oklahoma's criminal justice system. His story encapsulates themes of crime, punishment, legal battles, and the lasting impact of violence on victims and their families. Amber Matthews, the young woman whose life was tragically cut short, is remembered as a courageous individual who sought to protect those around her. For her loved ones, the execution of Grissom represents the fulfillment of justice, though no punishment can truly erase the pain of losing someone to such a senseless act of violence. The execution of a convicted murderer like Grissom also brings attention to the ethical considerations of the death penalty. Supporters argue that individuals who commit such heinous crimes deserve the ultimate punishment and that executions serve as a deterrent against future violent crimes. Opponents, on the other hand, question whether the death penalty is truly effective in preventing crime and highlight the moral implications of state-sanctioned killings. In addition to these broader societal debates, the emotional and psychological toll of executions on those involved in the process cannot be overlooked. The execution team, prison staff, and even the family members of the victims all experience significant emotional burdens. For some, witnessing an execution provides closure, while for others, it only deepens their grief. With only weeks remaining until Wendell Grissom's scheduled execution, the final legal processes are being carried out. Barring any last-minute interventions, he will be put to death on March 20, 2025, in the state of Oklahoma. His case serves as a stark reminder of the irreversible consequences of violent crime and the weight of the justice system's decisions. Whether viewed as an act of justice or a controversial practice, his impending execution marks the culmination of nearly 2 decades of legal battles, public discourse, and the unwavering pursuit of accountability for the murder of Amber Dawn Matthews. Finally, on to the next inmate on death row scheduled for March 2025 is Edward Thomas James. Edward Thomas James, born on August 4, 1961, in Bristol, Pennsylvania, is a convicted murderer and sex offender currently on death row in Florida. His life trajectory, marred by early exposure to drugs and violence, culminated in the heinous crimes he committed in 1993, leading to his death sentence. As of March 2025, James is scheduled to be executed on March 20th, marking a significant moment in Florida's criminal justice history. James's early years were fraught with instability and hardship. Believing his surname to be Matlack until the age of 10, he discovered that the man he thought was his father was, in fact, his stepfather. At 11, he met his biological father, a drug counselor who paradoxically introduced him to substance abuse. This period marked the beginning of James's tumultuous relationship with drugs, which would profoundly influence his later actions. Growing up in an unstable household, James was exposed to both physical and emotional abuse. His mother struggled with alcoholism, and his stepfather was known for his violent outbursts. This environment instilled in James a deep-seated anger and lack of emotional control, traits that would manifest in his later crimes. During his mid-teens, James returned to live with his mother in Castleberry, Seminole County, Florida. His behavior became increasingly erratic, characterized by frequent fights and escalating drug use. Despite his mother's efforts to seek help through mental health counseling, James's violent tendencies persisted. He dropped out of high school during his junior year and enlisted in the U.S. Army at 17. However, his military career was short-lived. Stationed in Germany, he was discharged for failure to conform, leading him back to Castleberry, where his life continued its downward spiral. His inability to maintain stable employment or relationships further contributed to his descent into crime. Upon his return, James befriended Tim Dick and became closely associated with the Dick family. In the summer of 1993, he rented a room from Tim's mother, Elizabeth and Betty Dick, in her Castleberry home. The Dick household was a hub of familial activity, often accommodating Betty's grandchildren, including 8-year-old Toni Marie Nooner and her 9-year-old sister, Wendy. This environment provided James with a semblance of stability, albeit temporary, as underlying tensions and his unresolved personal issues simmered beneath the surface. James struggled with feelings of inadequacy and resentment, which were exacerbated by his continued drug use. The tranquility of the Dick household was shattered on September 20, 1993. After returning from a party, James encountered Betty Dick's 4 grandchildren sleeping in the living room. In a sudden and unprovoked act of violence, he seized 8-year-old Toni Nooner by the neck, strangling her into unconsciousness. Believing she was dead, he carried her to his bedroom and sexually assaulted her. Toni succumbed to the injuries inflicted during the assault, her life tragically cut short. James's actions that night were fueled by a combination of substance abuse, psychological instability, and a complete disregard for human life. James's rampage did not end there. He proceeded to Betty Dick's bedroom, where he attacked her with a candlestick and a knife, inflicting fatal injuries. The commotion awakened 9-year-old Wendy, who witnessed the horrifying scene. James restrained her and confined her to the bathroom, assuring her that he would not harm her or her brothers. After looting the house for valuables, he fled the scene in Betty Dick's car, leaving behind a gruesome tableau of violence and loss. His departure from the crime scene was hasty and reckless, reflecting his desperation and lack of planning. The brutal murders of Betty Dick and her granddaughter Toni Nooner sent shockwaves through the Castleberry community and garnered national attention. Law enforcement agencies launched an intensive manhunt for James, who had become the prime suspect. On September 28, 1993, the case was featured on the television program America's Most Wanted, prompting a flood of tips from viewers across the country. The nationwide exposure significantly aided the authorities in narrowing down James's location. Several leads suggested that James was traveling westward. On October 5, 1993, the show aired an updated segment on the case, incorporating the latest information. The following day, a vigilant viewer recognized James at a California state unemployment office in Bakersfield and alerted authorities. He was promptly arrested, and during police custody, he provided 2 taped confessions detailing his involvement in the murders. His confessions were chillingly detailed, showing no remorse for his victims and instead focusing on his own misfortunes and struggles. James's trial proceedings were marked by his decision to plead guilty to multiple charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, attempted sexual battery, kidnapping, grand theft, and grand theft auto. He also entered a no-contest plea to 2 counts of capital sexual battery charged separately. This strategy was likely influenced by the overwhelming evidence against him and his taped confessions, which left little room for a viable defense. His legal team attempted to argue for leniency based on his troubled past and mental instability, but the heinous nature of his crimes overshadowed any mitigating factors. On August 18, 1995, the court sentenced James to death for the murders of Tony Nooner and Betty Dick. Additionally, he received sentences ranging from 15 years to life imprisonment for the other offenses. He was incarcerated at Florida State Prison in Rayford, Florida, where he has remained on death row. Over the years, James became known for his erratic behavior in prison, often getting into altercations with fellow inmates and correctional officers. Following his sentencing, James pursued the appellate process, a standard procedure in capital punishment cases. His appeals addressed various legal aspects of his conviction and sentencing, including the constitutionality of the death penalty and the adequacy of his legal representation. However, these appeals were systematically denied, as the courts upheld the original verdicts and sentences. His legal team attempted to argue that his confessions were coerced and that he suffered from severe mental illness, but these claims failed to sway the judiciary. In the years leading up to his scheduled execution, James sought clemency from the state of Florida. Clemency petitions often highlight factors such as the inmate's background, mental health issues, or potential rehabilitation. Despite these considerations, the gravity of James's crimes and the impact on the victims' families weighed heavily against granting clemency. Consequently, his petitions were denied, and the execution date was set for March 20, 2025. Victims' rights advocates and the families of Betty Dick and Tony Nooner strongly opposed any leniency, arguing that justice had been long delayed. The case of Edward Thomas James serves as a poignant example of how early life trauma and exposure to negative influences can culminate in devastating outcomes. His upbringing, marked by instability and substance abuse, likely contributed to his violent behavior. However, these factors do not mitigate the severity of his actions. The brutal nature of his crimes and the lasting impact on the victims' families ensure that his story remains one of the most harrowing in Florida's criminal history. As James's execution date approaches, his case continues to fuel discussions on the ethics of capital punishment and the effectiveness of the criminal justice system in preventing such crimes. Some argue that his death sentence serves as a deterrent for future offenders, while others question whether life imprisonment without parole would have been a more appropriate punishment. Regardless of differing opinions, Edward Thomas James's fate is sealed, and his execution will mark the end of a decades-long legal battle. For the families of his victims, March 20, 2025, represents a long-awaited moment of closure. While nothing can undo the horrors of that night in 1993, the execution of Edward Thomas James will stand as a testament to the enduring pursuit of justice in the face of unimaginable tragedy. This is True Criminal Records, specifically happened in the United States. I will be bringing all true criminal stories to you here on my channel. If you would like to get more information like this, comment and subscribe to my channel now.